"Mom, you can't keep living alone forever," my daughter said over roasted chicken and mashed potatoes, already discussing what would happen to my house as if I were no longer sitting at the table. I smiled and folded my linen napkin carefully onto my lap. If Vanessa had known about the lavender farm in France I bought with my own money 31 years ago, she would have spoken to me very differently that night. I'm Eleanor Whitmore, 68 years old, recently widowed, and according to my daughter, dangerously close to becoming a burden. The dining room still carried traces of my husband everywhere. Charles had chosen the chandelier above us during a trip to Savannah back in the 80s. His favorite jazz record still rested beside the turntable in the living room. Even the grandfather clock near the staircase seemed quieter since his funeral 3 months ago. Grief changes the sound of a home. It stretches silence into something heavy enough to sit beside you at dinner. Vanessa reached for her wineglass and exchanged a glance with her husband Daniel. It was one of those quick married looks people think older women don't notice anymore. "We're just worried about you," Daniel said in the calm voice he used in courtrooms and charity events. "This house is a lot for one person." I cut another small piece of chicken and nodded slowly. "I've managed homes before," I said. Vanessa sighed softly, the way mothers sigh at stubborn children. "That's not the point, Mom. Things are different now." Different. Such a polite word for what she really meant. Old. Alone. Vulnerable. I looked past her toward the kitchen window. Rain slid gently down the glass, blurring the lights from the neighboring houses. Charleston storms had always made Charles sentimental. He used to pour bourbon into crystal glasses and sit beside me on the porch listening to thunder roll over the harbor. Now the porch sat empty most nights except for me and a cooling cup of tea. "Daniel knows a wonderful retirement community outside Asheville," Vanessa continued carefully. "Private gardens. Full staff. People your age. People your age." I almost smiled at that. 30 years earlier, I had stood beneath endless rows of lavender in Provence with dirt on my shoes and sunlight in my hair while signing papers for a farm no one in my family knew existed. Back then I was younger than Vanessa was now. I had sold 3 paintings quietly through a gallery in New Orleans and used every dollar to buy something that belonged only to me for the first time in my life. Not Charles. Not the children. Not the family. Mine. I never told Vanessa because she grew up believing parents existed only as supporting characters in their children's stories. Charles knew I owned land somewhere in France, but he never asked questions. He respected silence when it carried meaning. Vanessa pushed her plate aside. "You could sell this place while the market's still strong," she said. "Downsize. Make things easier." Easier for whom, I wondered. The house was worth nearly $2 million now. Daniel probably already knew that. Lawyers always knew the value of things. But neither of them knew the true number hidden quietly across the Atlantic beneath rows of lavender swaying under the Provence sun. Dinner ended with stiff politeness and untouched peach cobbler. Vanessa kissed my cheek before leaving. Her perfume lingered in the hallway long after the front door closed. I locked the house, turned off the kitchen lights, and walked upstairs alone. At the back of my closet sat an old cedar box hidden beneath winter blankets. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the lid. Inside rested faded photographs, French tax documents, and a small brass key attached to a tag that simply read, "Provence." The next morning, I woke before sunrise the way I always had during my marriage. For a few seconds, lying beneath the pale blue comforter, I forgot Charles was gone. My hand moved automatically across the empty side of the bed, searching for warmth that no longer existed. The sheets were cold. Outside, rainwater still clung to the oak trees lining the street, and somewhere in the distance, a delivery truck rattled through the quiet Charleston neighborhood. I sat up slowly and wrapped my robe around myself before walking downstairs. The house creaked softly beneath my feet. Old homes have their own language. This one had learned my grief by heart. In the kitchen, I filled the kettle and opened the curtains above the sink. The garden looked overgrown now. Charles used to trim the hedges every Saturday morning with ridiculous precision, measuring everything twice as though crooked bushes might ruin civilization itself. I used to tease him about it while painting at the patio table. Now the hedges had begun leaning in uneven directions, like old men falling asleep in church pews. I made tea and carried the cup into the sitting room. The cedar box remained exactly where I had left it the night before. For several minutes, I only stared at it. Some secrets become so old they stop feeling real. I opened the box carefully and lifted one of the photographs from beneath the documents. The edges had curled slightly over time. In the picture, I stood beside endless rows of lavender under a July sky so blue it almost looked painted. I was 37 years old then. My straw hat sat crooked from the wind, and there was dirt on my white linen pants because I had insisted on walking the property myself instead of wearing the ridiculous shoes the realtor recommended. I remember the smell most clearly. Lavender and dry earth warmed by sunlight. It smelled like freedom. Back then, Charles was traveling constantly for work, and the children were finally old enough not to need me every second of the day. Vanessa had just turned 11. I loved my family deeply, but somewhere during those years I realized I had disappeared quietly inside my own life. Every conversation revolved around schedules, tuition, mortgages, dinner reservations, or someone else's needs. One afternoon during a solo trip to France, I wandered into Provence by accident after my train was delayed in Marseille. The farm was small then. Nothing glamorous. Just an aging stone house, neglected fields, and an elderly woman named Colette who wanted to sell before moving closer to her sister in Nice. I bought it 6 weeks later without telling anyone except my accountant in Savannah. I paid for it myself using money from paintings I had sold under my maiden name. Even now, thinking about it made me smile faintly. Into my teacup. No one in Charleston ever took my art seriously. They called it a hobby in the same tone people use for gardening or bridge club. Charles never mocked it, but he never understood it either. Vanessa certainly did not. To her, value existed only when attached to contracts, square footage, or investment portfolios. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. Vanessa. I let it ring twice before answering. "Good morning, Mom," she said brightly, too brightly. "Daniel and I were thinking maybe we could stop by later this week and help organize some paperwork for you. Insurance, taxes, all of that stuff can get confusing." I looked down at the photograph in my hand. The younger version of me stared back calmly from the lavender fields. "That is very thoughtful," I replied softly. "But I still know how to read my own documents." There was a pause on the line. Small. Tight. Almost invisible. Then Vanessa laughed gently, though I could hear irritation beneath it like a crack beneath fresh paint. "Of course you do," she said. "We just want to make things easier." Easier. That word again. After we hung up, I returned the photograph to the cedar box and locked it carefully. Then I carried my tea onto the back porch and sat alone beneath the grey morning sky. Somewhere across the ocean, lavender fields were beginning to bloom. 3 days later, Vanessa arrived unannounced carrying lemon muffins from the bakery near Meeting Street, the same bakery she used to beg me to visit every Sunday after church when she was little. Funny how adulthood changes people without changing their habits. I watched through the front window as she stepped out of her white luxury SUV wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying her expensive leather tote against one shoulder. Even from a distance, I could recognize determination in the way she walked. Quick steps. Tight jaw. Purpose disguised as concern. By the time I opened the front door, she already had that practiced smile on her face. "I was in the neighborhood," she said lightly, holding up the pastry box. "I thought you should not be alone all day." I thanked her and stepped aside. The house smelled faintly of furniture, Polish and chamomile tea. Vanessa paused in the foyer, glancing around with the careful eyes of someone mentally pricing antiques. I noticed things now that I once ignored. That is the strange gift grief gives older women. You stop wasting energy pretending not to see what has always been there. "The place feels darker lately," she murmured as we walked into the kitchen. "Maybe you should update some things." I set 2 plates on the table while she wandered toward the hallway. "Mom," she called casually, "have you thought any more about organizing Dad's documents?" There it was again. Not grief. Not memories. Documents. Accounts. Paperwork. I poured coffee slowly before answering. Most of it is already organized. Vanessa nodded absent-mindedly, though I could hear drawers opening softly in the next room. Silverware first. Then the buffet cabinet. Small sounds. Careful sounds. The sounds of someone pretending not to search. I remained seated at the kitchen table, stirring cream into my coffee long after it dissolved completely. Eventually she returned carrying a framed photograph from the bookshelf. It showed Charles and me standing beside a fountain in Savannah 20 years earlier. I still cannot believe he is gone, she said quietly. This time, I believed her. Vanessa did love her father in her own way. But love and entitlement often grow side by side inside families until people can no longer separate them. She placed the photo down and smiled again. Daniel thinks it might help if we make a complete inventory of everything. Just to protect you. Protect me. Such a polished word. I looked toward the staircase where afternoon sunlight stretched across the banister. I have managed this family for over 40 years, I said softly. I think I can still manage a filing cabinet. Vanessa laughed politely, but irritation flickered across her face before disappearing. Then her eyes drifted toward the old cookbook shelf beside the pantry. My stomach tightened slightly. Second shelf from the top. Behind the blue Italian cookbook rested several folded property tax letters from France I had hidden temporarily after reviewing them last month. I should have moved them sooner. Do you still use all these old cookbooks? Vanessa asked while reaching toward the shelf. Some of them, I replied calmly. She pulled one free at random, releasing a thin envelope that slipped quietly onto the hardwood floor between us. For a moment neither of us moved. The envelope had French stamps in the corner. Lavender printed along the border. Vanessa bent first and picked it up carefully. Her smile disappeared almost instantly. What is this? She asked. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. Mail. She turned the envelope over in her hands. Why are you getting letters from France? Outside, wind rustled through the wet oak branches while somewhere upstairs the grandfather clock chimed softly into the silence. Vanessa held the envelope carefully between her fingers as though the paper itself might explain everything if she stared long enough. I watched her eyes move across the French return address while the coffee between us cooled untouched. The room suddenly felt smaller. Not tense exactly. Just exposed. Like a curtain had shifted open an inch too far. It is nothing important, I said calmly. Vanessa looked up immediately. Mom, this is from France. Yes. Why? I reached for my cup again. Because people in France send mail too. Her jaw tightened slightly at my answer. When Vanessa was younger, she hated mysteries. At 6 years old, she used to open Christmas presents by peeling tiny corners of wrapping paper days before December 25th. At 16, she once read her father's surprise anniversary card to me before he could give it away because she wanted to know what was inside. Curiosity had never softened with age. It had simply learned better manners. You never mentioned anything about France, she said slowly. There are many things parents do not mention to their children. She sat down across from me, still holding the envelope. Is this about money? There it was. Not are you happy? Not are you all right? Money arrived in the conversation exactly where I knew it would. I folded my hands neatly on the table. Why would you ask that? Vanessa hesitated. Because after Dad died, there are responsibilities. Now, Daniel and I are trying to help you think ahead. Think ahead. Another polished phrase. Charleston society had perfected them over generations. People here rarely spoke directly when softer language could hide sharper intentions. I am already thinking ahead, I replied. Very carefully. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Rain tapped gently against the kitchen windows while the grandfather clock continued marking time from the hallway. Finally, Vanessa slid the envelope across the table toward me. Daniel is worried someone could take advantage of you, she said quietly. Especially overseas. I almost smiled at that. No one had taken advantage of me in France. Quite the opposite. Provence was the only place in my adult life where I had belonged entirely to myself. I remembered long summer evenings walking between lavender rows while cicadas hummed in the fading heat. I remembered signing contracts beneath open windows carrying the scent of rosemary and warm stone. I remembered silence that felt peaceful instead of lonely. Charleston had given me duty. France had given me breath. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, studying me carefully now. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. "How long has what been going on? Whatever this is." I looked toward the cookbook shelf. The blue Italian cookbook still leaned crooked where she had pulled it free. Behind it, another folded document remained half visible. A tax statement. My mistake. Vanessa followed my gaze instantly. I saw recognition flicker across her expression. Small details had always betrayed people more effectively than large confessions. She stood quickly and crossed the kitchen before I could respond. "Vanessa," I said softly. "Too late." She reached behind the books and pulled free the remaining papers. Several folded documents slipped onto the counter beside her. French property taxes. Insurance forms. A faded photograph of the stone farmhouse beneath rows of lavender stretching toward the horizon. The room fell completely silent. Vanessa stared at the photograph for several long seconds before looking back at me. Her voice changed when she finally spoke. Softer. Colder. "Mom," she whispered carefully, "what exactly have you been hiding from us?" Vanessa remained standing beside the counter, gripping the photograph tightly enough to bend one corner slightly. I noticed that before anything else. Not the suspicion in her eyes. Not the sharpness entering her voice. Just the way her fingers pressed into the image of lavender fields she did not understand. I stood slowly and walked toward her without rushing. "Be careful with that photograph," I said quietly. "It is older than your marriage." She looked down at the picture again. "This place is yours." "Yes." "Since when?" I pulled out a chair and sat back down at the kitchen table. There was no point pretending anymore. Secrets lose their shape once someone else touches them. "Since 1995, I answered. Vanessa stared at me as though I had spoken in another language. 1995, she repeated. "That was before Dad made partner at the firm." "Yes." "Before we moved into the waterfront house." "Yes." She blinked several times, trying to rearrange decades of assumptions inside her mind. "How could you afford property in France?" I almost laughed then. Not because the question was funny, but because of how completely it revealed her understanding of me. Vanessa knew every detail of her father's career. Every promotion. Every investment. Every business dinner. But she had never once asked how many paintings I sold in those years or why galleries in New Orleans occasionally mailed handwritten letters addressed to Eleanor Bennett instead of Eleanor Whitmore. "I bought it myself," I said simply. "With money from my artwork." The silence that followed felt different now. Heavier. Vanessa slowly lowered herself into the chair across from me. "Artwork," she said softly, almost cautiously. "Your paintings." "Yes. Mom, your little paintings paid for a farm in France." There it was again. Little. Such a small word. Small enough to hide disrespect inside it without sounding cruel. I folded the tax documents neatly into a stack before answering. "You were too busy growing up to notice much about me," I said calmly. Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. Somewhere. Upstairs the air conditioning clicked on, filling the house with a low mechanical hum. Outside, rain clouds had finally begun to break apart, allowing thin strips of sunlight to reach the wet garden. Vanessa picked up another paper from the counter. "This says the property includes over 30 acres. 32. And this valuation," she stopped reading suddenly. Her eyes lifted toward me again, slower this time. Different. I recognized that look immediately because I had seen it before at charity auctions and estate dinners after Charleston hurricanes destroyed older homes. It was the moment people realized there was more money in the room than they first believed. "Daniel needs to see this," she whispered. I leaned back carefully in my chair. "No," I replied. "He does not." Vanessa frowned. "Mom, this is serious." "I am aware. Why would you hide something like this from your own family?" I glanced toward the hallway where Charles's photograph still rested on the console table beneath the staircase. Because sometimes women need one thing in life that belongs only to them. Vanessa shook her head slowly. Dad knew. Some of it. Some of it. Your father respected privacy more than most people. That answer seemed to bother her even more. For years Vanessa had believed marriage meant complete transparency, complete merging, complete access. She and Daniel shared passwords, bank accounts, calendars, even phone locations. The idea that two people could love each other deeply while still protecting pieces of themselves felt almost offensive to her generation. She stood abruptly and reached for her purse. I think you should let Daniel look over all this, she said. There could be tax implications, legal issues, international regulations. I watched her gather the documents too quickly, too carefully. Leave the papers, I said softly. She hesitated. Then, reluctantly, she set them back down. But not before her eyes drifted once more toward the valuation number printed across the top page. And in that moment, for the very first time since Charles died, I realized my daughter was no longer looking at me like a grieving widow. She was looking at me like an asset. The house felt strangely quiet after Vanessa left, but it was no longer the quietness of grief alone. Something else had entered the rooms now. Calculation. I could almost feel it moving through the hallways like a draft beneath old doors. That evening, I sat in Charles's study with a lamp glowing softly beside me while rainwater dripped steadily from the porch roof outside. His leather chair still carried the faint scent of cedar and aftershave. I had not changed anything in the room since the funeral. His reading glasses remained folded beside a half-finished biography on Winston Churchill. Even the pen he used to sign Christmas cards still rested neatly atop the desk blotter. Some people remove traces of the dead quickly. I could not. Around 8:30, my phone rang. Daniel. I let it ring once before answering. Eleanor, he said warmly, using the careful voice people reserve for elderly relatives and nervous juries. I hope we are not disturbing your evening. Disturbing. Another polite word hiding sharper edges beneath it. Not at all, I replied. Vanessa mentioned you found some international property documents today, he continued smoothly. I just wanted to make sure everything is legally protected. I looked toward the window where raindrops blurred the garden lights into soft golden smears. The property has been legally protected for decades, I said. Of course, Daniel answered quickly. But foreign holdings can become complicated after a spouse passes away. Interesting. He already considered himself involved. Charles was never an owner, I replied quietly. There was a pause. Small. Controlled. But present. I see, Daniel finally said. Still, it might be wise for me to review the paperwork. Just precautionary. I almost admired how professionally he disguised greed as responsibility. Almost. I appreciate your concern, I said, but I already have attorneys in France. Another pause. Longer this time. I could practically hear him recalculating the situation behind the silence. In France, he repeated carefully. Yes. You travel there often? Not recently. But you own 32 acres there. The number sounded different in his mouth. Heavy. Valuable. Real. I leaned back in Charles's chair and studied the shadows along the bookshelves. Daniel, I said softly, when did my private life become a family committee project? He laughed politely, though the warmth had faded from his voice now. We are only trying to look out for you. No, I replied gently. You are trying to understand how much control you actually have. Silence. Complete silence this time. Somewhere downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed 9 times through the house. Finally Daniel cleared his throat. I think grief may be affecting how you are interpreting things. There it was. The oldest trick in respectable society. If an older woman becomes difficult to manage, suggest confusion. Suggest fragility. Suggest emotional instability wrapped in concern. I had watched it happen to widows at country clubs for years. Women who once hosted charity galas suddenly found themselves spoken to slowly by their own children after funerals. Their opinions became worries. Their instincts became stress. Their independence became unsafe. I stared at Charles's empty chair across the room. "You know," I said quietly, "people become very revealing once they believe a woman is alone." Daniel said nothing. "Good night," I told him softly before ending the call. For several minutes, I remained seated in the silence afterward. Then I opened the bottom desk drawer and removed the old cedar box once more. Beneath the photographs rested a second set of documents Vanessa had not found. Updated valuations. Partnership contracts with a luxury fragrance company in Marseille. Revenue reports from the lavender harvest. I ran my fingers slowly across the papers before reaching for my laptop. At the top of my inbox sat a message from Provence sent earlier that afternoon. Subject line: "The fields are blooming early this year." I stared at the screen for a very long time before clicking reply. 2 mornings later, I booked a one-way business class ticket to Marseille without telling Vanessa. The young woman at the airline counter smiled politely while printing my boarding pass, completely unaware that a quiet widow in a navy cashmere coat was dismantling her old life one careful decision at a time. I returned home with the ticket folded inside my handbag and found a bouquet of white lilies waiting on the front porch. Vanessa never sent flowers before. Not for birthdays. Not for anniversaries. Certainly not for ordinary Tuesdays. Attached to the bouquet was a cream-colored card written in her neat handwriting. "Thinking of you. Love, Vanessa." I stared at the flowers for several long seconds before carrying them inside. Grief flowers arrive immediately after funerals. Guilt flowers arrive later. By afternoon, another surprise appeared. Daniel called again, but this time his tone had softened dramatically. "We were thinking maybe you should come over for dinner this weekend," he said warmly. "The kids miss you." The kids. My grandchildren had not visited once since Charles died. Teenagers become busy, of course, but suddenly now the family wanted closeness again. "That is thoughtful," I replied. "I may be traveling soon." Silence settled briefly across the line. "Traveling?" Daniel repeated carefully. "Where to?" I walked slowly through the sitting room while speaking, running my fingers lightly across the polished piano Charles never learned to play properly. "France." The word landed exactly as I expected. "France," he echoed again, slower this time. "For how long?" "I have not decided." He recovered quickly after that, asking polite questions about flights and safety and accommodations, but beneath every sentence I could hear urgency moving quietly underneath. After we ended the call, I looked around the house differently for the first time in years. Not emotionally. Practically. The silver tea service from my grandmother. The Charleston watercolor above the fireplace. The stack of gardening books near the porch door. So much of my life had been arranged around preserving comfort for other people. Even the house itself suddenly looked less like a home and more like evidence of who everyone expected me to remain. That evening, I opened the cedar box once more and removed an old envelope hidden beneath the partnership contracts. Inside rested a single photograph of me standing beside Colette in Provence. Nearly 3 decades earlier. She had wrapped one arm around my shoulder while holding pruning shears in the other hand. We were both sunburned and laughing at something outside the frame. On the back of the photograph, Colette had written in blue ink, "Never let anyone convince you that your life ended because you became someone's wife." I sat motionless for a long time after reading those words again. Outside, cicadas hummed through the humid Charleston evening while headlights drifted past the front windows in soft golden streaks. Then my phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa. "Dinner Saturday?" I stared at the screen before typing a short reply. "I already have plans." 3 dots appeared instantly, disappeared, then returned. "What plans?" I placed the phone face down on the coffee table without answering. An hour later, another message arrived. This one from Daniel. "I spoke with an international property attorney today. There may be tax protections we should discuss before you make decisions." I read the message twice before smiling faintly to myself. We. Such a dangerous little word. Around midnight, unable to sleep, I walked downstairs and stood alone in the dark kitchen. Moonlight spilled faintly across the hardwood floors while the refrigerator hummed softly in the silence. Then I noticed something unusual. One drawer near the kitchen desk was slightly open. I was certain I had closed it earlier. Slowly, I stepped closer and pulled the drawer wider. Inside, my passport sat exactly where I always kept it, beside old insurance papers and takeout menus. But the documents beneath it had clearly been disturbed. The next morning, I woke with absolute clarity for the first time since Charles' funeral. Not peace exactly. Something colder. More useful. I stood in the kitchen wearing my cream-colored robe while sunlight spilled softly across the countertops, illuminating the slightly open drawer from the night before. Someone had searched through my documents. Carefully. Quietly. But not carefully enough. I closed the drawer slowly and began making coffee as though nothing had happened. By 10 o'clock, Vanessa arrived carrying grocery bags and concern arranged neatly across her face. "I thought you might need help preparing meals before your trip," she said brightly as she stepped inside without waiting to be invited. I noticed she looked tired. Curious people rarely sleep well around secrets. "That is thoughtful," I replied. She unpacked strawberries, soup containers, imported crackers Daniel liked pretending were sophisticated, all while glancing subtly around the kitchen. "You really are going to France?" she asked. "Yes. Alone. I have traveled alone before." Vanessa forced a small laugh. "Not recently." I poured coffee into 2 cups. People do not stop being capable simply because their children become uncomfortable. That landed exactly where I intended. She sat quietly at the table after that, stirring sugar into her coffee without drinking it. Finally she looked up at me carefully. "Daniel found some information online about the property." Of course he did. Lawyers become detectives the moment inheritance enters a conversation. "Did he?" "Mom," she hesitated before continuing. "Do you understand how much this place is worth now?" I folded a dish towel slowly before answering. "More than when I bought it." Vanessa exhaled sharply through her nose. "That is not funny." I was not trying to be funny. For a moment she looked almost emotional, but I had known my daughter too long to mistake frustration for vulnerability. "You kept this hidden from all of us for decades," she said quietly. "Why?" I leaned against the counter and studied her face carefully. Beneath the makeup and polished hair, she still resembled the little girl who once followed me through museums asking endless questions about paintings she did not understand. Somewhere along the way, curiosity had turned into entitlement. "Because it reminded me I still existed," I said softly. Vanessa frowned slightly. "What does that even mean?" I looked toward the backyard where the overgrown hedges moved gently in the wind. "When you spend 40 years making everyone else comfortable, people slowly stop seeing you as a person," I replied. "You become support staff for their lives." Vanessa looked down into her coffee cup. "That is not fair." "No," I agreed. Quietly. "It is not." The room fell silent again until her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen instinctively before turning it face down. But not before I caught Daniel's name. "He worries about you," she said quickly. "No," I replied. "He worries about access." Her expression hardened immediately. There it was. The moment politeness cracked enough to expose truth underneath. "Do not make us sound greedy," she said coldly. "We are your family." I walked toward the refrigerator and opened the door slowly, more interested in choosing strawberries than raising my voice. Family does not usually search through someone's passport drawer in the middle of the night. Behind me, complete silence. I closed the refrigerator gently before turning around. Vanessa's face had gone pale. "You think I went through your things?" she whispered. I held her gaze calmly. "Did you?" She looked away first. Small details reveal everything. The tightening fingers. The stiff shoulders. The sudden interest in untouched coffee. For years I had ignored these moments because mothers are trained to protect relationships at the expense of clarity. Widowhood had cured me of that habit. Vanessa stood abruptly and grabbed her purse from the chair. "You are acting paranoid," she said sharply. "And honestly, I think grief is affecting your judgment." There it was again. Fragile. Emotional. Unstable. The language people use when older women stop cooperating. I remained perfectly calm. My judgment, I said softly, is the clearest it has been in years. She stared at me for another second before walking toward the front door. But just before leaving, she paused beside the hallway table where Charles's framed photograph rested beneath the staircase. Dad would hate this, she murmured quietly. I looked at the photograph too. Then I answered the one thing I knew my daughter would never expect. No, I said gently. Your father would finally understand it. 3 days later, I stood inside Charleston International Airport with a single Navy suitcase beside me and my passport resting calmly in my coat pocket. The terminal smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish while early morning. Sunlight stretched across the wide windows overlooking the runway. Around me, people rushed toward business meetings, vacations, reunions, ordinary destinations. No one noticed the 68-year-old widow quietly leaving behind an entire version of herself. Vanessa had called 6 times the night before. I listened to none of the voicemails. Daniel sent 2 carefully worded emails about family communication and important legal discussions. I deleted both without replying. Somewhere between discovering the disturbed drawer and purchasing my one-way ticket, something inside me had settled permanently into place. Not anger. Certainly not revenge. Just clarity. I boarded the overnight flight with surprising ease. During the long hours above the Atlantic, I watched moonlight spill across the airplane wing while strangers slept beneath thin blankets around me. For the first time in months, no one expected anything from me. No decisions. No explanations. No emotional labor disguised as family concern. Only silence and the soft hum of the engines carrying me toward a life I once believed I had buried forever. By the time the car from Marseille reached Provence the following afternoon, golden sunlight had flooded the countryside. Endless lavender fields stretched across the hills in deep violet waves moving gently beneath the summer wind. Olive trees shimmered silver green against the horizon while old stone cottages rested quietly among narrow country roads. I lowered the car window immediately. The scent hit me all at once. Lavender. Dry earth. Rosemary warming beneath the sun. Home. My chest tightened unexpectedly as tears filled my eyes for the first time since Charles died. Not grief this time. Recognition. The driver turned onto the narrow gravel road leading toward the farmhouse, and there it was exactly as I remembered. The pale stone walls. The blue shutters. The climbing roses near the terrace. Older now, certainly. But still standing. Still waiting. Before the car fully stopped, the front door opened and a woman hurried outside smiling broadly beneath the sunlight. Madam Whitmore, she called in accented English. You finally came back. Isabel. Colette's niece. Older now too, with silver beginning to thread through her dark hair. She embraced me warmly before stepping back to study my face. You look tired, she said gently. I laughed softly. I have been living inside other people's expectations for a very long time. Isabel smiled as though she understood perfectly. She carried my suitcase inside while I remained standing in the lavender fields beside the house. Bees drifted lazily between blossoms while warm wind moved through the rows with a sound almost like distant waves. I closed my eyes and listened. No ringing phones. No careful manipulations hidden beneath concern. No conversations about what should happen to me now that I was alone. Just wind. Just sunlight. Just space enough to hear my own thoughts again. That evening, after dinner on the terrace, I finally listened to one voicemail from Vanessa. Her voice sounded strained, smaller somehow. Mom, she said quietly, I do not understand why you are shutting us out. I stared across the lavender fields glowing softly beneath the setting sun before deleting the message halfway through. Then I rose from the table and walked slowly between the rows as twilight settled over Provence. The air smelled sweet and clean beneath the fading light. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang softly through the hills. I thought about Charleston. About grief. About marriage. About all the years I spent shrinking pieces of myself to make other people comfortable. The woman who bought this farm at 37 years old had not disappeared after all. She had simply been waiting for me to return.